Let me tell you something you were never meant to know, something buried beneath centuries of silence, where blood and legend blur. They say there once lived a woman who burned an empire without lifting a sword. A widow, a mother, a queen. Her enemies thought they could humiliate her, break her, bury her alive, but instead, she turned her grief into fire. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a warning in the 10th century, when men ruled through violence. There rose a princess who ruled through vengeance, a woman named Olga of Kiev. The Drevlians killed her husband, mocked her, and demanded she marry their prince. But Olga didn't scream. She didn't cry. She smiled. And then she began to plan. What she did next is so cold, so calculated, that even the chroniclers of her time, hard men of war and scripture, trembled when they wrote it down. Because Olga didn't just kill her enemies. She erased them, and she did it with fire, wit, and an iron patience that history had never seen before. If you think revenge stories are brutal, wait until you hear how a widow from Kiev made warlords kneel. Imagine the frostbitten lands of early medieval Rus, vast forests where the mist clings to birch trees, rivers that gleam like veins of steel, and wooden fortresses rising from the snow. This was Olga's world. She was not born a queen. She was born somewhere in the wilderness, a girl of noble blood, but humble upbringing, clever and watchful. She married Prince Igor of Kiev, a warrior king known for his campaigns, his temper, and his hunger for tribute. Together they ruled a realm stitched together by conquest, trade, and fragile loyalties. But power in that age was never safe. In the year 945, Igor rode to collect tribute from a neighboring tribe, the Drevlians. They were proud, fierce people who had once paid Kiev in furs, honey, and silver. But they had grown tired of submission. They offered their tribute reluctantly, muttering under their breath as Igor's men counted the payment. And when the prince left, greed made him turn back for more. That decision cost him his life. The Drevlians ambushed him near their city of Isk. They bent two birch trees to the ground, tied Igor's legs to each, and released them. The trees snapped upright, tearing the prince in half. That was how a king died brutally, namelessly, in the mud. When word reached Kiev, Olga was alone in her chambers. Her son, Svyatoslav, was just a child. The hall fell silent as the messenger knelt before her and spoke. The words that would turn a wife into a weapon. Your husband is dead. The Drevlians killed him. History tells us she did not cry. Not then. Instead, she sat very still. Her fingers curled over the edge of the chair. Her eyes pale, calculating, lifted slowly to the fire burning in the hearth. The court waited for wailing, for tears, for a widow's despair. But Olga said nothing. That night, the city of Kiev held its breath. Days later, a delegation from the Drevlians arrived. They came not with remorse, but with arrogance. Their leader, Prince Mal, had a proposition. Your husband is dead, they told Olga. You should marry our prince. Be our queen. Unite our peoples. They thought she would submit, that a woman without an army or husband was powerless. Olga smiled. Your proposal is pleasing to me, she said sweetly, but I must honor you properly before I go with you. Rest tonight. Tomorrow I will receive you in my hall. The Drevlians, flattered, feasted in her city, boasting of their triumph. They slept easy, believing they had tamed the widow of Kiev at dawn. Olga ordered a great trench dug outside the palace long, wide, and deep. When the delegation arrived, dressed in fine furs and gold, she invited them to approach. "Tell me," she said, "how many men came with you?" 20, they said proudly. "Good," Olga replied. "You deserve a grand welcome. My people shall carry you in your boat as a sign of honor." The Drevlians, pleased with this strange custom, sat in their boat while Olga's soldiers lifted it high. But instead of carrying it to her hall, they carried it to the edge of the trench. The ground opened, and the soldiers tipped the boat in. The Drevlians screamed as they fell into the pit. Olga looked down at them and said calmly, "Is this honor enough for you?" Then she ordered the trench filled with dirt. They buried alive the first ambassadors of the Drevlians, and Olga stood there, unmoving as the soil swallowed them. That was the beginning. A few weeks later, she sent word to Prince Mal. "Your proposal was most noble," she wrote. "Send me your best men, for I am ready to go with you." Mal, unaware of her vengeance, sent his finest nobles, wise men, advisors, and warriors to escort her. When they arrived, Olga greeted them graciously. "You have traveled far," she said. "You must rest before we go. The bathhouse is prepared." The men entered the wooden bathhouse, steam rising from the stone stove. It was warm, comforting, almost holy. But when the door closed, Olga gave a single command: "Lock it." The guards barred the door. Then she ordered the building set ablaze. The flames devoured the bathhouse, and the screams that rose from within were carried. Across the Dnieper River, Olga watched the fire burn until the roof collapsed. "You have washed well," she whispered. Still, she was not done. She sent yet another message to the Drevlians. "I am coming to your city," she said, "but I wish to honor my husband's grave first. Prepare a great feast where he died." The Drevlians, desperate to please her, obeyed. They built a banquet hall near Igor's burial mound, decorated with pine boughs and silver goblets. When Olga arrived, she wept publicly for her husband, dressed in mourning, her tears glinting in the torchlight. The Drevlians, softened by her display, joined her in drinking. Then they drank more and more, when they were drunk beyond reason. Olga raised her cup and said softly, "Now for my husband." At her signal, her soldiers drew their swords. That night, more than 5,000 Drevlians died at the funeral feast. Still, Olga was not finished. Her vengeance was methodical, like the turning of a wheel, each step premeditated, each act colder than the last. She had destroyed their ambassadors, their nobles, their army, but the city of Iskoristan still stood, and Olga never left a wound half-healed. She gathered her army and marched on the Drevlian stronghold. The city's walls were tall, its gates strong, but its people, weary, terrified, barred themselves inside. For months she besieged them. Then, one day, she sent them an offer. "You have suffered long enough," she said. "I will show mercy. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household, and I will go home." The Drevlians, desperate, agreed. Olga's soldiers collected thousands of birds. That night, the queen gave each soldier a small bundle of sulfur tied to a piece of cloth. "When you release the birds," she ordered, "light the cloth." As the birds flew back to their nests in the eaves, under roofs, in barns, the city of Iskoristan ignited within minutes. The sky turned red. The flames leapt from house to house, consuming everything. The Drevlians ran screaming into the streets, but Olga's army was waiting. Those who fled were cut down. Those who surrendered were enslaved by dawn. The city was gone. The chronicles say Olga watched the fires burn with no expression, a statue carved from ash and vengeance. And when it was over, she walked into the ruins and claimed the land for Kiev. That is how a widow became a legend. The smoke of Iskaristan hung in the air for days, a crimson veil over the blackened remains of a city that had once dared to defy her. The snow that fell that winter turned grey with soot, and the rivers carried ashes downstream for weeks. Olga rode through the ruins on a white horse, her armor glinting faintly beneath her mourning cloak. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as she passed. Behind her, her soldiers followed in solemn ranks, their faces pale from the horror of what they had witnessed. None dared to speak. She had avenged her husband. She had burned her enemies to dust. And yet she felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of order restored. Revenge, she realized, was not the end. It was the beginning. For the first time in Rus, a woman had seized control, not through marriage or inheritance, but through sheer, merciless will. Her vengeance had become her coronation. Back in Kiev, the people waited. The widowed queen had left as a fury, but now she returned as a ruler. The nobles, uneasy, whispered that the gods themselves had favored her. The priests crossed themselves when she walked past, half in reverence, half in fear. The peasants called her the woman who would not burn, because she had survived the fire she had lit. But Olga knew that revenge alone could not keep a kingdom. Her son, Sviatoslav, was still a boy, fearless and reckless, like his father had been. The nobles would test her. The foreign traders from Constantinople would watch for weakness. And so, Olga did what no ruler of Rus had done before her. She began to govern, not with rage, but with reason. She reorganized the tribute system, the very one that had led to Igor's death. No longer would greedy princes collect tribute at will. Olga established fixed tribute stations, called pogosti, and designated officials to oversee them. She created a structure of taxation, justice, and trade that transformed the loose federation of tribes into the beginnings of a true state. It was bureaucracy, born in blood. The people obeyed, not just from fear, but from awe. She was not like other rulers, not impulsive, not drunk with power. She was deliberate. Her word was law, her silence more powerful than any threat. In the palace, the servants learned her rhythms. She woke before dawn, often to pray before a small wooden icon, not of a pagan god, but of a figure unknown to most of her people, Christ. For Olga had heard of a new faith spreading from Byzantium, a faith that promised redemption instead of vengeance, peace instead of conquest. It intrigued her, though she did not yet understand it. At court, foreign envoys arrived from far lands, Scandinavia, the Baltic, the mighty Byzantine Empire. They brought gifts, silks, icons, scrolls, gold. They also brought rumors that the emperor in Constantinople ruled a city of marble, that its churches gleamed with gold mosaics, and that its god was more powerful than any idol of the north. Olga listened. Her curiosity grew until it became resolve. She would see this empire herself. In the summer of 957, she set sail down the Dnieper River, her ships gliding over the water like silver blades. Her retinue followed, warriors, servants, priests, interpreters, a floating court. The journey took weeks, through rivers choked with reeds and across the Black Sea's open expanse. when they reached Constantinople, the greatest city in the world at that time. The people of the empire lined the harbors to see her. Never before had a queen from the wild northern lands arrived with such poise, such regal bearing. Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, received her with astonishment. She was nothing like he had imagined, not a barbarian, not a conqueror. She was dignified, sharp, and impossibly composed. In his writings, he later described her as a woman of great intellect and beauty, wondrous in wisdom. During her stay, Olga witnessed the splendor of Byzantine ceremony, the golden domes of Hagia Sophia, the choirs that echoed like thunder in marble halls, the scent of frankincense rising like mist. It was another world, one of discipline, ritual, and divine order, and there, something stirred in her. For all her power, Olga had lived in a world ruled by violence. But in Constantinople, she saw power wrapped in serenity, an empire that ruled not by the sword alone, but by the soul. The patriarch spoke to her of Christ's teachings, of forgiveness, mercy, and eternal life. Words that might have once sounded weak to her now struck differently. She, who had burned cities, began to wonder if a different kind of fire could cleanse her instead of destroy, and so, in a grand ceremony within the cathedral, Olga was baptized into Christianity. The emperor himself became her godfather, a symbolic gesture that bound her to Byzantium. They called her Helena, after the mother of Constantine the Great, the saint who had found the true cross. When she rose from the baptismal font, water dripping from her hair, the court gasped. The fire that had once destroyed now shimmered with a strange calm. Later, chroniclers whispered that the emperor, enchanted by her wisdom and beauty, proposed marriage. But Olga smiled and refused. "You are my godfather," she reminded him gently, "and it would be unseemly." It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. She had refused an emperor without offending him. When she returned to Kiev, her ships laden with Byzantine gifts, her people gathered on the riverbanks to welcome her. They expected a queen. What they received was something closer to a saint. Olga tried to bring the new faith home. She built wooden churches and invited priests from Constantinople. But her people were stubborn, still loyal to the gods of thunder and oak. Even her son, Sviatoslav, mocked her prayers. "I cannot understand this," he said. "My men would laugh if I worshipped a crucified god." Olga did not argue. "You will come to believe," she told him quietly, "when the time is right." She ruled wisely for many years, guiding her son as he grew into a warrior like his father. She negotiated with emperors, forged alliances with traders, and strengthened the walls of Kiev until it gleamed like a fortress of iron and wood. But age crept upon her, slow and relentless, when the day came that she could no longer walk without aid. She sat in her palace overlooking the Dnieper and watched the sun set over her city. The waters reflected the fire of dusk, and for a moment she thought she saw Iskorosten burning again. She remembered the screams, the smoke, the silence afterward. Had she been right to do what she did? The question had haunted her for years, growing heavier with every prayer. The priests told her that vengeance belonged to God, that her sins could be washed away. But Olga knew that her vengeance had not been God's. It had been her own. And yet, she also knew that without it, Kiev might not have survived. Her enemies would have devoured her. Her son would have grown up under the shadow of weakness. Her dynasty would have died before it began. Perhaps, she thought, the Lord forgives those who burn for survival. When she died in 969, She left behind a realm stronger than any before it, organized, feared, and destined for greatness. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, would one day convert the entire nation to Christianity, fulfilling the prophecy she had planted like a seed in blood and tears. The people buried her with honor in a stone church. She had built herself, not in the pagan burial mounds of her ancestors, but in holy ground. The chroniclers say her tomb emitted a faint scent of roses. Years later, when the church was rebuilt, they opened her coffin and found her body incorrupt, untouched by decay. The people called her Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. The woman who had once burned cities now burned with holiness. But the truth of her story, the full, terrible beauty of it, lived in the spaces between scripture and legend. Because Olga of Kiev had not been born a saint, she had made herself one act of fire at a time. The bells of Kiev tolled low over the frozen river the morning Olga's body was carried through the city. Men who had once feared her now wept openly, and women pressed their children forward, whispering that they should remember the face of the woman who had ruled when men faltered. The scent of pine smoke mixed with incense, and the procession wound like a dark ribbon through the snow. Her coffin, carved from white stone, gleamed faintly in the pale light of dawn. Beneath the cold sky, the people spoke of her not as a queen, but as a legend, one whose story would outlive all of them. Yet even as they mourned her passing, the power she had built began to tremble. Her son, Sviatoslav, was a man of war. Where his mother had been deliberate, he was driven by instinct, swift, fearless, and brutal. He scorned diplomacy and worship, laughed at the gods of others, and trusted only in the edge of his sword. Under his rule, the Kievan army stormed across the steppe, conquering tribes and burning cities in the name of glory. But he lacked Olga's vision. Where she had built order, he spread chaos. The nobles grew rich, but restless. The borders stretched too far to defend. And though Sviatoslav won battles, he made enemies on every horizon. Olga's death had left him with an empire, but not her wisdom to keep it in the quiet corners of the palace. Servants still spoke of the old queen's foresight. She said it would come, one old nurse whispered, clutching her shawl. She said the blood she spilled would echo, and echo it did. For just a few years after her death, Sviatoslav himself was ambushed by the Pechenegs, nomadic warriors of the steppe. They cut him down on the banks of the Dnieper and turned his skull into a drinking cup. His death plunged Kiev into darkness once again, the realm fractured. Olga's legacy trembled on the edge of ruin, but the wheel of fate that had once turned for her began to turn again, this time through her grandson. Vladimir, a man who would inherit both her blood and her fire. Vladimir was not meant to rule. He was one of many sons, born of Sviatoslav's countless conquests. Yet something in him, some spark passed from Olga herself, refused to fade. He was bold, cunning, and hungry for more than the sword could give. When his brothers fought for the throne, Vladimir fled north to Novgorod, gathered an army of Norse mercenaries, and returned like a storm. One by one, he defeated his rivals, until the throne of Kiev was his. But though the crown rested on his head, his heart was uneasy. He had seen his father's ruin and his grandmother's faith. He remembered, as a child, watching her pray quietly in candlelight, her lips moving in words he could not understand. He had laughed then, as his father had, but now, ruling over restless tribes and fickle nobles, he began to wonder what strength she had found in those prayers. Vladimir's early years as prince were marked by excess and blood. He rebuilt the old pagan temples, sacrificed animals and sometimes men to Perun, the god of thunder. He took wives and concubines beyond count, his lust matching his ambition. Yet for all his indulgence, something in him remained unsettled. There was no peace in conquest, no light in the endless dark of war. It was said that one night, while riding alone through the forest, he dreamed of Olga standing before him, not as an old woman, but as she had been in her prime, her hair silver as frost, her eyes calm as the river. She did not speak, but the air around her shimmered with the faint scent of incense. When he awoke, he could still feel her presence. For days afterward, the thought would not leave him. He began to ask about her journey to Constantinople, her baptism, the strange faith she had brought home but never forced upon her people. And so began the search that would change the soul of a nation. Vladimir summoned envoys from the great empires of the world. The first came from the Muslims of the Volga Bulgars, preaching the words of Allah and offering a brotherhood bound by prayer and law. But when Vladimir asked about their customs and heard that drinking was forbidden, he laughed. "Drinking," he said, "is the joy of the Rus. We cannot live without it." Then came the envoys of the Jews, speaking of wisdom and suffering, of the one God who had cast them out and still kept them chosen. Vladimir asked, "Where is your kingdom?" And they answered, "Destroyed, scattered among nations." He shook his head. "A people without a land are not for us." Next came the Christians of the West, sending priests from Rome who spoke of discipline and faith. Vladimir listened, but found them cold, their words brittle as parchment. "Their faith," he said, "lacks glory." Finally, envoys from Byzantium arrived, men of silk and gold, bearing icons and incense. They spoke of Hagia Sophia, of the divine light that filled its dome, of the splendor of the emperor who ruled by God's grace. And when Vladimir sent his own men to Constantinople to see it with their eyes, they returned transformed. "We did not know," they said, trembling, "whether we were in heaven or on earth. There is no such beauty anywhere in the world. There, God dwells among men." That was the moment Olga's seed, planted decades before, finally bloomed in the year 988. Volodymyr made his choice. He would do what his grandmother had only dreamed. He would bring all of Rus into the faith she had embraced. But Vladimir was no gentle preacher. He was a warlord, and he converted his people as he had conquered his enemies, with force and command. He ordered the idols of the old gods torn down and dragged through the streets. The statue of Perun, the thunder god, was whipped before being hurled into the river. When it surfaced near the banks, people wept, but Vladimir only laughed. "If he were a god," he said, "let him save himself." Then came the day of baptism. The people of Kiev were ordered to gather by the river Dnieper, men, women, and children. Priests from Byzantium stood ready with crosses and holy water. Some resisted, but the fear of Vladimir's army pressed them forward. And so, beneath the same sky where Igor had once died and Olga had once burned her enemies, a new fire was born, not of destruction, but of rebirth. The chronicles say the river ran white that day with the garments of those who stepped into its waters. As the priests chanted, the people felt the chill of the river and the heat of the sun. And when Vladimir himself waded in, tall, proud, his sword at his side, a hush fell. He crossed himself clumsily, like a soldier learning gentleness. And as the water touched his head, a strange calm overtook him in that moment. The curse of blood that had haunted Olga's line was broken. When Vladimir emerged from the river, dripping and dazed, he felt the weight of his grandmother's ghost lift from him. For the first time, he understood her silence, her patience, her transformation. She had burned to cleanse, he had drowned to be reborn. Kiev changed swiftly under his rule. Churches rose where idols had stood. Priests taught the people to read and write in the new script brought from Byzantium. The city became a center of light in the dark northern world. And at the heart of it all stood the memory of Olga, the woman who had carried the first flame across the river of faith. Sometimes, late at night, Vladimir would walk the corridors of the palace and pause before the icon that bore her face. The artist had painted her eyes wide and solemn, her hands clasped in prayer. "Babushka," he would whisper, "you were right." The years passed, and Vladimir grew old. His sons quarreled for power, as sons of kings always did. But the faith he had planted remained, even as his empire fractured after his death. The cross of Christ stood firm over Kiev, a monument not to the princes who fought, but to the woman who had once ruled through fire. And so, long after her bones had turned to dust, Olga's influence lived on, in law, in faith. In memory, the chroniclers of Rus wrote her name beside the apostles. The monks of Byzantium sang hymns in her honor. And in every wooden church that rose across the snowy plains, her spirit flickered in the candle flames, a reminder that even in an age of violence, one woman's will could change the course of nations. When people spoke of her, they no longer whispered her vengeance, but her wisdom. Yet among the old storytellers, the skalds and bards of the north, another tale endured. They said that on cold nights, when the mist rolled from the river and the moon turned red, a woman in silver armor could still be seen standing on the banks of the Dnieper, her gaze fixed toward the horizon where Constantinople lay. Her eyes burned not with wrath, but with something deeper, a quiet fire, the kind that neither time nor death could extinguish. They called her Olga the Unburned, the queen who turned vengeance into faith, the mother of saints and conquerors. Her story became a myth, the kind that roots itself in the marrow of a people. And though the centuries that followed would bring invasion, tyranny, and despair, the Rus would always remember her not just as a ruler or avenger, but as a symbol that even from ashes, greatness can rise. Centuries passed, and the memory of Olga of Kiev became more than history. It became prophecy. The land she had ruled with iron and fire transformed under the shadow of her legacy. The wooden palaces gave way to stone. The pagan idols rotted in forgotten groves. Churches of white limestone rose along the Dnieper, their domes gilded like suns. The people who had once bowed to thunder gods now crossed themselves before icons glowing with gold leaf. And through it all, one name was whispered by candlelight and sung in the monasteries: Olga, the queen who burned the old world and gave birth to a new one. Her grandson, Vladimir's baptism, had set a wheel in motion that no man could stop. The Rus became not just a people, but a civilization. Faith became the language of power, and Olga's vision, the seed she had carried back from Constantinople, bloomed into something immense. The monks wrote of her as equal to the apostles, the first light that pierced the northern dark. But time, ever hungry, began to twist her story in Kiev. Priests spoke of Saint Olga, the gentle mother who turned from vengeance to holiness. But in the villages and forests, the old people still told the other version, the one whispered by firesides when the wind howled. They told of Olga the Avenger, the woman who buried men alive and burned cities with birds. Some said she was not fully human, that the gods of the old world had touched her, that she was part flame, part frost, and that her spirit still walked the earth when injustice rose to high. Both stories were true. In their way, by the 12th century, Kiev was no longer the rough frontier Olga had ruled. It was a city of merchants and monks, its markets thick with the scent of spices and furs, its libraries heavy with books copied by hand in the flickering light of oil lamps. Princes ruled not by blood alone, but by lineage sanctified through the church. And always, in the gilded chapels, Olga's image stood among the saints, serene, unyielding, watching over them all. But the peace she had built was fragile, as peace always is. The sons and grandsons of Vladimir turned their swords on one another. Brothers fought brothers, cousins betrayed cousins. Each claimed divine right, each swore they fought for faith, but behind their holy words lay hunger for land, for gold, for glory. And when the fires came again, they did not come from within, they came from the east in 1237. A sound like thunder rolled across the steppes, the hoofbeats of the Mongols. They swept through the lands of Rus like a storm, their arrows blotting out the sun, their banners black against the snow. City after city fell, Ryazan, Vladimir. When they reached Kiev, the jewel of Olga's line, its golden domes glimmered faintly under the winter sky. For a brief moment, the people believed the holy city would be spared. But holiness does not stop fire. The Mongols came with catapults, firebombs, and iron discipline. The siege lasted only days. When the walls fell, the city was drowned in blood. The chronicles say the Dnieper ran red for a week. The cathedral of Saint Sophia, where Olga's name had been chanted for 200 years, was looted and defiled. The icons were smashed, the bells melted, the altars overturned, and yet, somewhere in the chaos, a handful of monks carried a single reliquary from the ruins. It held the bones of Olga of Kiev. They fled under cover of smoke, hiding the relics in a small church by the river. For generations, no one knew where she lay. Kiev became a graveyard of ashes, but her legend did not die. It moved with the survivors, northward, eastward, wherever the Rus fled. And wherever they went, they carried her story with them, like a torch against the dark. She burned once for vengeance, they said, and she will burn again when we rise. In the forests beyond the Volga, her name became a symbol of endurance. Mothers told their daughters that strength did not come from softness, but from survival. Priests preached her patience. Warriors prayed to her before battle. She had become both saint and spirit, vengeance and mercy, the paradox of the Rus itself. 200 years after the fall of Kiev, a new city began to rise from the ruins of the East Moscow. It was small at first, a fortress of timber and stone on the banks of the Moskva River. But within its walls, something stirred, a sense of destiny. The princes of Moscow claimed descent from the rulers of Kiev. They called themselves heirs of Olga and Vladimir. And as the Mongols' hold weakened, they began to weave her legend into their own dot in their chronicles. They wrote of Olga not as a distant saint, but as a divine protector of the motherland. They told how she had been the first to unite the Rus, how her fire had purified the land. And as Moscow grew in strength, her story became a banner, a symbol that this new power was not a usurper, but a resurrection. When Prince Ivan III cast off the Mongol yoke in the 15th century, he stood before his soldiers and swore by the wisdom of Saint Olga and the courage of Saint Vladimir. It was more than devotion. It was propaganda, a reminder that their rule was born from holy lineage. Olga had once avenged a husband. Now her name avenged a nation in the Kremlin, under domes of gold and walls of red stone. Icons of Olga were painted anew, not as the vengeful widow, nor as the quiet saint, but as a queen holding a torch. Artists gave her the face of both fire and serenity, her gaze turned eastward, toward the lands still unclaimed. She became the eternal matriarch of the empire that was rising, Mother Rus, incarnate, but her spirit was not at peace. Legends from that time spoke of strange dreams that haunted the princes of Moscow. They saw a woman clad in smoke, her crown melting in the heat of invisible flames. Her eyes were full of sorrow, as though she mourned what had become of her legacy. "You have built my temples," she whispered, "but forgotten my truth." For the empire that rose in her name grew as ruthless as the one she had destroyed. The fires of conquest that had once cleansed the steppe now consumed nations. Olga's vengeance had become empire. Her patience had turned to power. And yet, even in that, her paradox endured. Because with every act of cruelty, the people still found comfort in her story. The story of the widow who rose from ruin, the queen who forged order from chaos. In every war, every famine, every invasion, her name surfaced again like a talisman. She was the memory of endurance, the soul that refused to be erased. When Moscow became the heart of a new empire, and the double-headed eagle of Byzantium spread over its towers, the patriarchs declared Russia the third Rome, the last guardian of the true faith, and they crowned her in words and prayers as their eternal protector. "Saint Olga," they said, "who kindled the light of Christ in Rus, guard us from darkness, but the darkness always returns." In time, the empire she had inspired began to devour itself. Tsars rose and fell, each claiming divine right through the same faith Olga had brought. Some were tyrants, others were dreamers. Blood soaked the snow just as it had in her time. The Mongols were long gone, but new enemies took their place, foreign invaders, traitorous nobles, and the endless hunger of power itself. Still, through centuries of suffering, Olga's fire burned quietly beneath it all, sometimes dim, sometimes blazing. When plagues swept the cities, her icons were carried through the streets. When peasants rebelled, her name was invoked as both blessing and curse. In times of peace, she was the soft voice of forgiveness. In times of war, she was the reminder that vengeance, too, could be sacred. Her story had become the mirror of her people's soul, mercy and fury, faith and fire intertwined. And so it was that in the 16th century, when Ivan the Terrible stood in the cathedral built on her legend's bones, he too prayed to Olga. They said he wept before her icon, whispering for her strength, and perhaps her absolution before riding out to burn the lands of his enemies. The chroniclers never agreed whether she answered him, but one monk wrote that, on the night Ivan's armies set fire to nothing, a storm rolled across the sky and lightning struck the cathedral's golden dome. The monks who survived claimed they heard a woman's voice in the thunder, not a scream, not a curse, but a sigh, as if even Olga herself had grown weary of what men did in her name. And yet her image endured, her legend growing even as empires rose and fell. The peasants still carved her likeness into wood, painting her eyes wide with sorrow and her hands folded in eternal prayer. In secret, the women of the villages whispered her other name, the one the church never used, Ogniana. she of the flame. They said if a woman wronged by fate prayed to Olga at midnight, lighting a single candle before her icon, the flame would never go out until justice was done. And more than once, when cruel husbands or greedy lords met sudden, inexplicable ends, the villagers swore they had seen a flicker of red light in the windows, like the ghost of fire passing through. That was the contradiction that made her eternal. Olga of Kiev, who burned cities to avenge her husband and prayed for the souls of her enemies. Olga the saint, Olga the flame, Olga the mother of Rus, a queen who became a saint who became a myth, and a myth who became a mirror of all that her people were, their mercy and their wrath, their faith and their fire, bound forever in her name. Time has a way of erasing faces, but not fire. Empires rise and fall, languages change, thrones vanish into dust, yet legends linger like smoke. Olga of Kiev had been dead for more than 1,000 years, but her shadow stretched across them all. Even in the 21st century, when cities hum with electric lights and the rivers run with steel bridges instead of blood, her story still flickers beneath the surface of the land that once knelt to her. The fire she lit in vengeance had become something larger, something eternal, a flame that no conquest, no revolution, no ideology could ever truly extinguish. They still speak her name in whispers in Kiev, in Moscow, in every place the Dnieper winds. Her image is carved in stone outside cathedrals, printed on icons, painted in gold leaf. She looks out from murals with the same unflinching calm eyes of a woman who has seen too much, lips that hold both mercy and judgment. But what most don't realize is that behind those painted eyes lies a warning. Olga's story was never meant to be simple. She was both the avenger and the saint, the destroyer and the builder. Every time someone tries to claim her, the church, the empire, the revolution, she slips through their grasp like smoke, reminding them that power is never pure, and righteousness is never clean. When the Russian Empire collapsed in the fires of 1917, the icons of saints were torn from the walls, burned by hands that claimed to worship only reason. But even then, even in the age of iron and revolution, some soldiers carried small wooden charms of Saint Olga around their necks. They called her the unburning mother, protector of the desperate. Old women in peasant shawls whispered her name when their sons went to war. Even those who no longer believed in God believed in her, in the idea that a woman once wronged could rise from ashes and change the fate of nations. During the Second World War, when bombs fell on Kiev and the sky turned red again, people said they saw her, not in flesh, not as a ghost, but as a shape in the firelight, a woman in armor, her eyes gleaming through the smoke. In one story, a German officer entered St. Sophia's Cathedral and fired his pistol at her icon. The bullet cracked the glass but did not pierce the wood. That night, his camp was hit by artillery, and every man who had seen him shoot was killed. The surviving soldiers whispered that the city itself had eyes, that its saints still guarded it. The locals said only one thing: Olga has awakened. It was strange how her vengeance and her faith endured side by side. In every age, people chose the Olga they needed. The conquerors prayed to her for victory. The oppressed prayed to her for justice. The broken prayed to her for courage. The tyrants who claimed to follow her forgot what she had suffered. The widows who had lost everything remembered exactly why she burned in the cold years after the war. Under the iron rule of ideology, her name went silent again. Churches were locked, relics hidden, saints erased from textbooks. Yet even then her story survived, passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter, from story to song. In whispered lullabies, she was not Saint Olga but Ogniana, the woman who would not kneel, the widow who turned grief into strength, and then, like all legends do, she returned when the world needed her most. In the late 20th century, as the Soviet Union crumbled and old faiths resurfaced like bones in thawing earth, Olga's face re-emerged everywhere. Her icons were restored in churches. Streets and schools were renamed for her. Artists painted her again, not in the stiff, holy poses of medieval icons, but as a living woman, fierce, intelligent, scarred, and magnificent. She no longer belonged only to the church. She belonged to history, to memory, to every woman who had ever been told to endure in silence. Scholars debated her. Was she a saint or a sinner? A visionary or a murderer? A political genius or a monster? But history rarely gives such neat answers. Olga's greatness lay not in her purity, but in her humanity. She was what the world made her, and what she chose to become despite it, in modern Ukraine. Her story carries a different weight. She is not just a relic of faith, but a symbol of resilience, a reminder that this land has always risen from ashes. When cities burn, when borders shift, when empires fall, Olga's legend whispers, "We have survived worse. We will survive again." Her vengeance has become defiance. Her fire, endurance, and in Russia, too, her legacy burns, though in a more complicated light. There she is, the mother of empire, the first link in a chain of destiny stretching from Kiev to Moscow to every corner of a nation that once called itself holy. The same fire that forged unity has also justified conquest. Each age takes her flame and molds it to its own reflection. But if you strip away the centuries of ceremony, the gold, the marble, the myth, what remains is still a woman. A widow standing before a fire, her enemies buried, her heart hollowed, her hands trembling, choosing what to do next. That choice, that moment when vengeance met vision, is what made her eternal. Imagine her now. The night is quiet. The Dnieper glimmers under a veil of mist. A city hums around her, electric lights where once torches burned, and there, on the riverbank where she once stood, the faint outline of a woman takes shape, a figure woven from smoke and moonlight. Her hair streams behind her like flame. Her eyes are calm but endless. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her voice carried by the wind, soft, steady, ancient. "I burned because I had to," she says, not in guilt but in understanding. "I built because no one else would. I carried the fire so others could carry faith." The river ripples, reflecting the lights of the modern city. Kiev, reborn from ruin, more times than the world can count. The ghosts of her vengeance are gone, but the strength remains. In every mother who protects her children, in every person who refuses to break, in every soul who stands when the world would rather see them fall, there she lives again. For Olga's story was never just about revenge, it was about transformation. The alchemy of grief into purpose, of suffering into power. That is why she endures when so many conquerors and kings have faded into dust. Because she was not content to destroy. She learned to build. She did not simply take vengeance. She turned it into vision. The priests who wrote of her called her equal to the apostles. The poets who sang of her called her the flame of Kiev. The people who feared her called her the she-wolf of the north. And yet, she was all of them, because history never births saints from peace. It births them from chaos, from pain, from fire. Even now, her fire flickers in ways most never notice. When candles burn before her icon, the flame sometimes bends as though moved by breath. When storms rise over the Dnieper, lightning splits the sky where Iskaristan once stood. When the wind blows through the birch forests, it carries the faint scent of ash and pine, as if reminding the world that once, long ago, a woman turned fire into faith. Every year, on the day of her feast, pilgrims gather before dawn in the churches of Kiev. They light candles, not out of fear but reverence. The priests chant her name, but it is the silence between their words that holds her truest memory, that space between vengeance and holiness, between the scream and the prayer. And in that silence, the city breathes her in, the same way it has for 1,000 years. She is in the bones of its walls, in the rhythm of its bells, in the courage of its people. Every empire that tried to claim her has fallen. Every conqueror who tried to twist her name has been forgotten. But Olga remains, because some fires are not meant to burn out. They are meant to light the way. And if you ever walk the streets of Kiev at night, when the river shines like glass and the churches stand quiet under the moon, stop for a moment and listen. You might hear it, a faint crackle, a whisper in the air, the sound of vengeance turned into prayer, the echo of a woman's footsteps on stone. And if you look closely enough, in the shimmer of the water or the glow of a candle, you might see her, not as a ghost, but as the memory of strength itself. Olga of Kiev, the princess who would not burn, the widow who built an empire, the saint who rose from fire. And though 1,000 years have passed, she is still here, watching, waiting, reminding us that the greatest power in history has never been cruelty or conquest, but the will to endure, and the courage to turn pain into purpose. That is why they called her Blessed Olga. That is why they still do. The fire that once consumed her enemies now burns in the hearts of all who survive. The flame of vengeance has become the light of faith, and long after every empire has turned to ash, she will still be standing, unburned, unbroken, eternal,